The sky isn't falling, but the land sure is. New cards enter, but can they stop the format favorites? Find out right now. There was a crap ton of Magic the Gathering coverage this weekend. Specifically, standard Magic the Gathering tournament coverage this weekend, and across 4 different regions and 4 different events, whether it was Europe, Central America, Taiwan, or Richmond, Virginia in the US. You had 3 different regional championships and a spotlight series featuring the most recent addition to Standard, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles set, all being blasted at basically 24/7 if you could watch it all, even if that was possible because of the overlapping time zones and everything. Regardless of that though, there are new cards popping up in Standard. There are older fan favorites from a couple of seasons ago that are still kind of showing they have what it takes to place very highly in these events, which means that we have a ton of things to talk about. So if you haven't seen one of these videos before, I'll let you know how this is going to work. We're going to take a look at the combined metagame overall for all 4 events and go over the breakdown of all the different deck archetypes that got played this past weekend in Standard. From there, we're going to be looking at what is most popular. So if you're still going to be grinding Moto Leagues or in the dwindling ashes of your RCQ Standard season, you can kind of see what to expect at those events and see how it stacks up against the field as a whole, and if maybe there's something you should try playing there. From there, we're going to look at the top 10 win rate decks, whether it is no sample size or looking at 3 or more. One is going to entice the Brewers, the other one is going to entice the Meta Breakers, and we're going to take a look at how those different deck archetypes performed. From there, we're going to go into our more popular decks again, and we're going to be looking at the top 11 presence decks and their head-to-head matchup matrix, because, spoiler alert for the next part, there are 2 different decks that tied in 10th for overall presence, so we're just going to take a look at both of them. Now, as always, we're using the Melee platform's reporting system for all 4 of these events. Thankfully, we're all on Melee, so it makes this a lot easier for us. And there were 1,959 registered players across all 4 events. Now, unfortunately, there were 46 players that had no deck list assigned to their name. Some of these were no-shows, some of these were people who showed up and then dropped later on. There's a whole plethora of different information that's been floating around when I was asking about these things. Specifically for the event in Europe, there are a lot of players that were dropped after round 1, whether they didn't show up or they just showed up and just dropped like at the table kind of deal. So because of this, I am treating all of those matches paired against a no deck list player that were played in round 1 of an event as a bye. That means, since we know from the thing over here, that buys are not counted in win rate. So all of these are basically kind of counted as matches, but not affecting the win rate of the decks and them getting pretty much a free win for an opponent or some sort of logistical error. Now, there are, of course, some troll deck lists, but rather than kind of lumping them all under the same troll deck list moniker, some of them did play some games, so I assigned them their own specific deck archetypes based on what was in them. Of course, we had the standard, all lands decks with 60 different basic lands registered. Those are lumped together, but there's some interesting things where people kind of looked at all the TMNT cards that they could get their hands on and threw them together with a bunch of singletons in a deck. You want to look at those, we'll see the names when we do the metagame breakdown overall. However, with all that stuff aside, I also went through and made over 190 changes to the deck archetypes to better match them to the like list between events. A lot of this is going to be because being across 4 different continents and 4 different languages at a minimum, if not more, for different areas, this means that there were a lot of different ways to describe similar deck archetypes. Dimir Demons, Dimir Excruciator, Dimir Control, Dimir Combo. All very similar type things. But Izzet Prowess, Temur Prowess, Temur Aggro, Izzet Aggro, Izzet Spells, all these different deck list names. There's going to be a changelog that I've actually posted on social media. If you want to find that, I'll link it in the description below in this section here when you look at those little timestamps as well, if you want to see all of those changes. So I've done a lot of editing, so if my data looks different than someone else's, this is gonna be why. Now, of course, I've gone all the way through the finals for all of these events. Buys, as I mentioned earlier, do not count towards win rate. Ties do, unless we're looking at the win rate minus ties statistic. So that's been a lot of information I kind of thrown out there. Thank you so much if you listened to this, and let's get to the data. 4 different events across the weekend meant tons of different standard decks, 153 different archetypes to be exact, or 152 if you want to get rid of that no deck list archetype. Now, if you were a pilot that was rocking your one and only copy of your own standard brew, you're one of 71 different pilots that made up 46.4% of the deck share metagame, pieing solo in this one. Now, if you wind up having one of 2 copies of a deck archetype in a room, there are 29 total pilots like that, making up 19% of the deck share metagame breakdown. You want to expand that over to decks with 3 copies in the room, we had 11 pilots, making up 7.2 of the deck share metagame. Now, there were 5 different deck archetypes that had at least 4 copies across the events, potentially 1 per each, but that's not exactly how it worked out, going to be 3.3% of the deck metagame share. Now, if you wind up being one of 4 pilots that shared an archetype, or 5 of those archetypes altogether, it was going to be 2.6 of the deck share metagame, were 4 pilots rocking 5 copies of a deck. Now, looking at the fact that there were pilots, or 2 pilots, that ran decks with 6, 7, 8, and 9 different copies of the archetype in the room, it made up 1.3, 1.3, 1.3, 1.3% of the deck share metagame. That means if you want to look at all the different deck archetypes that had at least double-digit copies across the room, there were 25 different ones of that. 16.3% of the deck share metagame was made up by what is considered the top or the more popular of the metagame decks. As much as things change, things still stay the same, and an Izzet deck is at the top of the metagame here across these 4 events, but this time it's Prowess with 267 pilots across the 4 events this weekend, making up a 13.6% share of the metagame. Now, not to be outdone, the former favorite, Izzet Lessons, is still packing a punch in second most popular. 228 pilots made up 11.6% of the deck metagame. Now, Mono Green Landfall has been putting up results recently, and more people are noticing. It's the 3rd most popular deck at 10.7% metagame share, with 209 pilots across these 4 events this weekend. And Dimir Midrange, well, the pilots out there are still trucking and trying to find out the best way to throw Kaito into decks. 144 of them made up 7.4% of the metagame share. Izzet Spellementals came back in force, slinging spells and Sunderflocks alongside some Eddie Merc crabs. 99 different pilots on the deck made up 5.1% of the metagame share. Dimir Excruciator is still trying to force a big demon to mill at your opponents in combination with Restless Reef or a couple of other control spells. 97 different pilots brought this deck to the 4 events in total, making up 5% of the metagame share. Simic Rhythm, Badgermole Cub, and all of its friends, 73 pilots, still think that blue and green is the way to go. They made up 3.7% of the metagame share this weekend, while Azorius Tempo is still alive and kicking and growing in metagame share. 61 different pilots across the 4 events made up 3.1% of the meta this weekend. Although if you add green into that, you get Bant, as in Bant Airbending, because Aang is present in both of these decks. 52 pilots took the creature combo deck to the events, making up 2.7% of the metagame share. And then last but not least, we have 2 decks tied for the 10th place in metagame share. The Momo White deck, using Momo's Springleaf Drum and more, had 49 pilots at 2.5% of the metagame share, and Mono Red Aggro, not Momo Red Aggro, wound up making up the same exact amount of pilots and the same 2.5% metagame share. Now it's time for us to shift gears away from what made up the event as a whole and just focus on what was most popular at the event using my popularity tier analysis. Now this section looks to identify what was played the most at an event and compare it to the other decks within the same tier of popularity using a distribution of deck archetypes at the event, which uses standard deviation to assign tiers from D at 1 deviation below the average all the way up to S, the highest deviation above the average. Now this does a little more than just look at how high the metagame share was and can reaffirm if a deck was a good choice for an event at all. Now while this is not a be-all end-all overview of the format, this analysis looks to help in preparation for your own events at your LGS or online, as you can expect to see more of the higher tier decks compared to the lower tier ones, but then you can also assess if you need to prepare more or less for them based on their performance. Taking a look at the S-tier decks across the 4 events, there's a new contender for top popularity deck in town, as a different version of Izzet rocks the top slot of these S-tier decks with Izzet Prowess. So if anyone told you that Izzet spell slinging was dead, even though that's kind of what Izzet Lessons does, that death was greatly exaggerated. Now, out of all of these decks, these are the ones that you can expect to see the most during the dwindling down of RCQ season for Standard, and these are the things that you're going to see over and over and over again. Your mono green Landfalls, which are winning events, Dimir Midrange, which are popping up in Fury to kind of combat a bunch of the different creature-based decks, and of course, the pair of Izzet decks themselves. Now, Izzet Prowess did rock a 52.3% win rate, despite being the most played deck across all of the events, so we already know that this popularity deck has the power to back it up. The speed of the deck is going to be great against some of the decks that take a couple of turns to set up, and is still going to be able to combat those other decks that it wants to race against. Much like the mono green Landfall deck, which although it isn't the most popular deck in the room across these 4 different events, it is still packing the highest win rate of these S tier popularity decks. So these are the 2 decks that you're probably looking to take to some sort of closed deck list event if you want to have the best chance against the field of decks like a small RCQ or an online Moto League or something. Doesn't mean that Izzet Lessons to mid-range have fallen in power. Lessons did kind of fall in overall win rate, although it's still just barely below 50%, and Dimir Midrange is kind of chugging along as well. It's had some up and down weekends. This one was a little bit more down, but 48.2% win rate, being below 50% win rate, but still kind of close to even, doesn't mean it's an awful deck to choose from. Specifically in the mid-range camp, there's a couple of different versions of the deck that you can run, a couple of cool Ninja Turtle cards, a couple cool ninjas in general that you could put in there that work well with Kaito, but overall, these are going to be popular decks you need to be prepared to face or potentially want to take yourself to an event. The 2 different A-tier decks are also kind of familiar phases you've been playing Standard this season, with the once Pro Tour winning Dimir Excruciator deck falling down to a 44.2% win rate against the field. This is mostly because, well, the Dimir Excruciator deck is a very known quantity, and it plays like a control deck that has a combo inside of it. Now, there are a couple of different ways the deck plays, some staying more true to the lean creature build and just kind of going for control with the demon itself, and then others that are splashing a couple of different creatures or a couple of different potential things to spice up their list, like Malboro or other things from Final Fantasy. But overall, the Dimir Excruciator deck is a known quantity now, and its win rate is falling because people are just prepared to play against it. Izzet Spellementals, on the other hand, has gone up in win rate overall, as the metagame kind of goes back to playing good creatures or playing a lot of creatures, like some decks we'll talk about later on in the breakdown. Overall, this is going to be good for the deck that basically is a Thing in the Ice style upheaval all of your opponent's creatures type thing. So 52% win rate for the Izzet Spellementals list. As long as you're going to keep playing against decks that need to play creatures to beat you, Spellementals is going to be a great deck to take to an open field event. B tier again sees some of the fan favorites from earlier in the Standard rotation, with Simic Rhythm and Bant Airbending both rocking a 48 and 48.9% win rate against the field overall respectively. Now, although Simic Rhythm has fallen a lot in popularity, its power level is fluctuating with the decks in the metagame around it. When people come prepared to kill all of your Badgermole Cubs as soon as you play them, or bounce your entire giant board of creatures as soon as you play them, Simic Rhythm's not going to be great. But when people are playing decks that are more one-for-one sort of card advantage things, or a little bit on the slower side, Simic Rhythm's going to be a great choice to play. Here, across the 4 different events, it comes in below average, so we can assume that people were prepared to face it, like the Izzet Spellementals deck that can bounce all its stuff, or the aforementioned Izzet Prowess deck, which is speed and single target removal. Bant Airbending, on the other hand, is a combo deck that, as it kind of waxes and wanes in the way it gets built, also kind of fluctuate within the meta. Now, Bant Airbending had been on a larger downtrend, specifically because the explosive starts with Badgermole Cub were getting punished, similar to the way the Rhythm decks are playing. So, Bant Airbending isn't playing it as much anymore, at least in some of the lists, and the win rate is going up because it's just kind of going back to what makes it good, which is the combo that wins the game. So if you're going to be playing Bant Airbending, take a look at some of the lists that we'll either go over in some of my other videos or just throughout these events with the deck list linked below to see which version of the deck you're kind of feeling if you want to try this deck at an event. Now, Azorius Tempo was an up-and-coming deck, and although its numbers have kind of gone slowly up and its metagame share has been climbing alongside it, it did take its first win rate hit overall, as again, people now kind of know what's coming. Now, 48.9% 53.7% win rate isn't all doom and gloom, and it's actually still doing better than Dimir Midrange, which I was still pretty excited about seeing being played. And I still think the Azorius tempo deck has a very specific place in the metagame where it punishes decks that are trying to play a little bit slower and does kind of grab control of the game once you have tempo thanks to cards like High Noon. You can also slow down opponents extremely well with things like Authority of the Consuls and just being able to undo their turns with Aang and then keep them off their toes with Aven Interrupter is a powerful combination of cards. Azorius Tempo might not do as well into an unknown field, but if you kind of know what your LGS is playing, you can kind of configure your Azorius Tempo deck to attack that specific part of the metagame. Now, C tier has a whole bunch of different decks, and while I'd love to touch on absolutely all of them, I'm probably just going to hit a couple of the highlights. I'm actually going all the way down to the bottom of this list to point out the Bant Rhythm list, because we just talked about Simic Rhythm and it being punished in the current metagame, but the Bant Rhythm deck, while there were many less versions of them at the events, had a 58.6% win rate. Now, the Bant Rhythm deck does have a specific kind of toolbox build that, alongside Nature's Rhythm, runs Breakglass Gearhulk to find a bunch of 1-ofs that are not creatures, or 1-drop removal and interaction spells that the Simic deck does not have access to. Because of this, we're seeing an increase in win rate overall, so if you're thinking about taking a Rhythm deck to one of your RCQs or events like that, take a look at the Bant colors and see what that has to add to the package, and if that's something that could better attack the metagame you're facing. Likewise, I do want to point out towards the bottom of the list is the Azorius Momo deck. Now, we did talk about Momo White, which is all the way up at the top here. These two different versions of the deck are using the low-cost flyer to get aggressive on the board. However, the Azorius ones are playing a bit more of like a play to the board and tempo style, have the blue cards for a little bit of extra interaction, Angs, and some no more lies type effects, whereas the Momo White version all the way at the top is increasing in win rate overall by just playing to the board and trying to win the game by using their tempo and mana advantage very aggressively. 53.8% for Momo White, 47.8% for Azorius Momo. Just goes to show that maybe being a little more aggressive with Momo is the way to go about it. Speaking of Momo, Boros Dragons was the deck that kind of introduced Momo into the metagame, or at least the top tables of it. It took a hit this event, 49.3% win rate overall. Unfortunately for Boros Dragons, which was rocking above 50% or even like 52-ish% win rates at some of the past events, it has kind of gone down as the deck is a little bit slower than what some of the other Momo decks are bringing to the table. Now, things like Izzet Elementals have spiked as well. Anything that's running Sunderflock into a field full of creatures is going to be absolutely great. So 52.3%. If you don't want to kind of play the spell slinging style that Spellementals does, Izzet Elementals is more of a mid-range kind of deck that does wind up having some explosive turns and playing things ahead of curve as well, but can attack the metagame in a very similar way thanks to Sunderflock just being a card in general. The Monument decks and all of these kind of discard matters decks took a hit overall to their win rate. We had Grixis Monument, which was one of, I believe, the top 10 win rate decks in one of my last videos, 45.4% win rate, and Rakdos Monument, 49.7% win rate overall. So although these creatures do have a discard kind of style and an aggressive attack plan, they aren't quite hitting the mark as much as they were just a couple of weeks ago. Let's step away from the popularity contest and instead look at what decks were doing the most winning, regardless of how many copies were in the room at the event. Now, this is going to be looking at overall win rate in the percentage of games won, not total wins or total games played. This is going to allow us to look for some of those sleeper OP decks, even though they weren't out in full force this weekend, and it's going to be able to put that in perspective based on how successful they were in the hands of smaller amounts of pilots. Now, the caveat is these are 2-day events, which means that some of these lists could have not made day 2 despite having a positive record. So as always, keep in mind the sample size because it does matter when you're thinking about breaking the format. Boros Dragons is already using Momo-friendly fire to some great success, but leave it to pilot Zevin Faust, the inventor of the Azorius Tempo deck, to take something good and make it potentially even better. Momo is still pairing up with Nova Hellkite in this list, however, Springleaf Drum and Starfield Shepherd take center stage in a version of this deck that is splashing red for removal, the big top-end threats, but still playing to the board fast and furious, combining with Halia Guided by Light to gain some life, draw some cards at the end of your turn, and Khazagran Zenith to really benefit from the spell velocity you're flinging onto the table. Boros Momo put up a decent performance from Zevin, but he didn't
play in the second day of the event and decided to play limited instead. So at a 7-2-0 record, who knows how far this deck could have gone. Now, Michael Simonetti also wound up playing the deck, but unfortunately went 2-2 and then dropped out of the event as well. I think Boros Momo has some legs, and it needs a little bit of a boost compared to Boros Dragons, who did have a slightly rougher weekend overall. Dan Schriever stayed in the event for both days, going 10-4-1 with a Golgari version of Landfall, and although there are a couple of Golgari cards in the sideboard, the real add to the main deck is Season of Lost, going for that Golgari graveyard angle of attack, and really benefiting from the fact that Icetail Explorer is going to be milling over a bunch of things into your graveyard, in addition to just using the paw print modes for whatever you need at any given point in time. Now, this was a 4 of in the main deck, which makes it very distinct from all the other versions of Landfall that have been floating around more recently, even though the backbone of the deck is basically the same. Now, you're not playing Sapling Nursery in the main deck because you are playing the Season of Losses in what I assume is the exact same slot, but Dan piloted this deck to a 31st place finish at the Spotlight Series TMNT, so something is going good even though there's a Season of Loss in the deck. Now, no, this is not straight Izzet Prowess. Pilot DavidYeh added main deck Questing Druid to their deck in order to make it full Temur, although other versions of this deck at the event also wound up going into things like Hunter's Talent that set it apart in archetype from the way that the normal Izzet Prowess deck functions. Now, overall, it still performed pretty decently. DavidYeh actually took 11th place overall at the championship in Taiwan with this version of the deck using the Questing Druid in general as the main green splash. So if you're thinking that Izzet Prowess is already a pretty strong deck, but you're wondering why some people aren't using Questing Druid like they were before, well, some people are, and they're putting up some decent performances at international events. So if it's something that you are really kind of looking to do, you might as well go out and try it because it's having just as much success as some of the other versions of Prowess are. Now, the downside is there's no green cards in any of these sideboards, so the Temur is a very, very light splash, but you may be able to tick it up a notch and maybe add in some artifact and enchantment removal. The website says Rakdos Rummaging, but my heart says Rude Rakdos should be the name of this deck. Using the titular class enchantment Cool But Rude, named after Raphael and his line in the Ninja Turtles cartoon theme song, this deck is looking to do what the Rakdos Monument deck is doing, but kind of in the same package of a singleton card. Cool But Rude is its own enabler, and when you level it up to level 2, will continue to throw things at your opponent's face to deal damage. But unlike in the art where Raphael is throwing a pizza, we're throwing Magic the Gathering cards directly into our graveyard. Now, there are 3 different copies of this deck across all of the events this weekend, and some of them utilize Iron Shield Elf. However, Brian Zeng had a 8th place finish at the Spotlight Series TMNT, and that was utilizing just Bloodthorn Flail alongside some ETB Rummage creatures, FOMO, and then we had Inti Seneschal of the Sun as a more aggressive spin on the deck. Now, we still had creatures that love being discarded. Bloodghast and Flamewake Phoenix love being in the graveyard. Maraude Mako and Moonshadow benefit from discarding these cards, specifically Moonshadow, since these are permanent cards. And then we added 2 other Universes Beyond creatures into this deck to just kind of round it out and give it a bit more resiliency. Carnage, Crimson Chaos, if you discard that, it has Mayhem, so you can play it from your graveyard that turn as well. We'll also bring back a friend alongside it. Casey Jones, Vigilante, is a newer addition from Ninja Turtle set as well, where you draw 3 cards to restock your hand, and at the beginning of your next upkeep, you're going to discard 3 cards at random. Now, while that does seem a little bit of a rough thing to do, you can wind up putting Bloodghast, Flamewake Phoenix, or Carnage into your graveyard and just bringing them back the next turn, but you're also getting 3 separate instances of discard for Cool But Rude to dome your opponent in the face. All in all, this is a really cool spin on the Rakdos aggro shell that is still using Fear of Missing Out for multiple combats, Inti to give trample and +1/+1 counters, and just benefits all across the board, even if you don't have the titular card in play. Timur Lesson says, who needs a monument when you have the greatest earthbender of all time?
Toth Hard-Headed Teacher combines with Storm Chaser's talent to give this deck recursion upon recursion for all of the lessons that you're going to wind up having in your graveyard. Now, while Toth does only care about instants and sorceries in general, that means that we can kind of branch out and put some non-lessons to the deck as well. Fire Magic being a slightly better sweeper than running multiple Iros demonstrations, Stock Up giving the list more of a control and restock type of feel, and then of course you wind up having Boomerang Basic, Storm Chaser's talent, multiple ways to loop. Whenever you're going to be casting these spells, you Earthbend 1, and if it's an lesson, you're going to be putting an additional +1/+1 counter on that land as well. So all of this combined with Toth in play is going to be turning your lands into creatures that go wide alongside all of your otter tokens that you're creating. We still have Grand to get the good card advantage on early, and then we even top off at Ral Crackling Wit to keep those otters going, keep that card advantage going. And hey, you don't really care about discarding these lessons into your graveyard if it's going to be activating your Accumulate Wisdom, or you're going to be able to kind of quote-unquote flashback them back or bring them back to your hand with the leveled up Storm Chaser's talent or with Toth entering the battlefield. So all in all, this deck is a different spin on the lessons decks that we've been seeing, and even though there are only 4 copies across the event, Alexey Paulot just barely missed out on top 8 in the regional championship in Turin running this style of list, and it did have a better win rate than the Izzet version of the deck this past weekend. Granted, it's a little more unexpected, but if you're thinking about changing things up a little bit with your lessons list, take a look at Temur.
Alright, so the Jeskai control players splashed black for inevitable defeat, so it was only a certain amount of time before they did the same thing for the Jeskai mid-range players, right? So because of this black splash, the mana changes, and everything that it comes with this, just by adding 3 to 4 copies of inevitable defeat, we get 4-color mid-range, which had a pretty decent weekend across 2 different decks. Pilot MarcelineOrion actually went 10-4-1 on the weekend at the Spotlight Series Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, going 36th overall with a list that uses Shiko, Aang, Gwen, and Ashling in great effect. Plays a couple of copies of Day of Judgment, but mostly relies on stock-ups, card advantage, and 4 copies of the Legend of Kuruk or Avatar Kuruk on the flip side to really pressure the board at the same time as you're doing some control-y things on the stack. Now, Inevitable Defeat is just a pretty solid can't-be-countered removal spell and does do a little bit of extra damage, where in a version of the deck you need to finish through combat a lot more frequently is a nice thing to have.
Now, we touched upon the Bant Rhythm deck in the popularity section just a little bit, but we're going to talk about it again because it's 58.6% win rate on the weekend across 14 different decks in the different events, made it the 3rd highest win rate deck on the weekend. Now, Bright Guy's Gear Hulk was the kind of tutor piece alongside Nature's Rhythm that we added to really make this a Bant-style deck, and that's going to be able to find a bunch of one-drop interactive pieces, whether it be Melt Strider's Revive, Seam Rip, or Soul Guide Lantern to give it a little bit of a better Graveyard Matters deck matchup. We still wind up having the Crater Hoop Behemoth to overrun everybody, all the creature package, the Spider Manifestations, our Llanowar Elves, and of course, Badger Mole Cub. However, we are wind up packing a Singleton Beza the Bounding Spring in pilot Andrea Fortunati's winning list from the regional championship in Turin. So the deck has a little bit of a different angle to it and just has the ability to kind of stabilize against some of the more aggressive landfall type strategies while also buffering its life total against some of the aggro decks that are trying to race it. Now, we don't wind up having any copies of Bossing Say in the winning list, although that in and of itself has made it into a bunch of different style of decks. When you're splashing in the 3 colors, you don't necessarily see it in the main deck as much as you see it in the sideboard, but the sideboard package is just getting bigger and bigger with all of their kind of silver bullet spells. One of the more interesting things to note is Andrea's list had 2 copies of Sage of the Skies in the sideboard as well, which, because you're banned, you can actually cast this card and you're going to be getting 2 flying threats alongside all of the other mono dorks that you're putting onto the battlefield. So if you pump them up with an Ouroboros or you wind up running them over with a Crater Hoof Behemoth, you have 2 flying things you're going to be dishing out tons of damage. Hey, remember Arabella Abandoned Doll from Duskmourn? Yeah, well, this is her now with one of the highest win rates in Standard across 4 different events. Yet 3 different pilots wound up taking Boros Arabella, which was a different spin on a Boros aggro deck that really wants to care about all of these small 1 and 2 power creatures on the battlefield so that you can dish out extra damage during the combat step. 57.1% win rate on the weekend is something to take note of, as this doll was played alongside Delny Streetwise Lookout to double a lot of the effects from all of these small types of creatures. Things like Voice of Victory or mobilizing twice, Arabella's attacking and dealing damage twice, and you round it all out with War Leader's Call, which not only turns these 1 power threats into 2 power threats, but when you mobilize or you put things onto the battlefield and you cast multiple of them in a later turn because they are all cheap spells, you wind up getting a bunch of damage pinging down to your opponent's face. So if you are playing an aggressive style of deck, if you really want to find something that is not only putting tokens on the battlefield, but is playing a more red aggressive strategy as opposed to the green and white versions of the decks, you may want to take a look again through your just draft pile there and see if you find your Arabellas and all these other cards to kind of go alongside it and potentially put up some results like this weekend.
But had a smaller record. This is not a product of a deck that failed to day 2, rather than a smaller event, as Pilot Zan 2 took 20th place, going 4-3-0 using a Golgari Ouroboros deck that really relied around the +1/+1 counter synergy that Ouroboros and other cards were bringing to the table for the Golgari colors. We wound up using Mikey and Leo, Chaos and Order, a newer card from TMNT that allowed you to draw cards at least once per turn every time you put a counter on something, which synergizes extremely well with a card we have in standard already, with Hollow Merc Siege, which basically does the same exact thing, but this will let you put it on Abzan sometimes instead of just needing to put it on Sultai all the time first if you want your card advantage. Plus, it's another creature to put counters on, so why not? We also wind up having Agnosaur Rex to cycle and put counters on things, Paw Patchery Crew, as well as Llanowar Elves to ramp and get aggressive earlier on, and then a plethora of 1-drops as well that you wind up kind of tutoring for or finding through your deck and drawing cards. You don't necessarily have the same Nature's Rhythm or even Lively Dirge package that the other Golgari decks are packing, which is why this one is strictly Ouroboros and counters matter, rather than being like a rhythm or tutor-centric deck. Let's talk about Grixis Affinity. Pilot Maximilian Hogland took this deck to an 8-6-0 record in Turin, and it looks pretty sweet. Now we have Krang Mastermind with literal affinity in standard for the first time in what seems like forever, although I'm probably missing some things, but it combines with Pinnacle Emissary, which is something that people are doing in Modern. So if you wind up seeing a deck that is running cards that are Modern playable in standard, you're probably already doing something pretty cool. A plethora of artifacts in this deck gives it a little bit of an equipment and +1/+1 counters matter sub-theme, in addition to being able to utilize Lady Octopus inspired Inventor using Sewer Valence Cam to untap it to utilize Lady Octopus more than once per turn. So every single time you're drawing extra cards, you're putting counters on it, then you can put extra artifacts into play. You play 1 mana to Sewer Valence Camera, untap the Lady Octopus, you put another one into play. It's just a very good engine to have to put a lot of low-cost equipment onto the battlefield, and then every single artifact that enters, Pinnacle Emissary and Ravenous Robots, is going to be making tokens alongside of it. That's going to grow your Krang, that's going to grow your improvised arsenal, and it's just going to do a lot of damage to your opponents. Does Machines, the Donatello class, is also in this deck to bring things back from your graveyard if it so dies or you mill it over, and then can turn some of these extra artifacts laying around into beaters in and of themselves, thanks to its final level, putting 3+1/+1 counters and making it a robot if it's not already a creature. Simic Prowess is yet another sub-archetype of the Prowess deck, as Pilot Glenn Curry took this list to a 9-6-0 record at the Magic Spotlight Series Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but this one is definitely a lot different than the others because it cuts red entirely. That means no Slick Shot show-off, that means no burn spells. Instead, we're playing Drakehatcher as a 3-of Elusive Otter and 4 copies of Astrologian's Planisphere, so slinging our spells and drawing cards are definitely going to help our creatures grow large. We have 4 copies of Bushwhack, 2 copies of Rhino's Rampage, and 2 copies of Overprotect, all in the main deck to add an additional little buff in power and toughness alongside all of the prowess triggers we're having. It's of course going to wind up protecting some of our creatures better, and 2 copies of Hunter's Talent make it into the main deck as well, just to provide not only just a little bit of extra oomph to it, but give our attacking creatures trample so that prowess damage actually sticks, since we're missing the flying aspect of our Slick Shot show off from red. Overall, I actually like the direction this deck is going in. I don't know if this is like a final product or anything, but I like the fact that we have access to these pump spells in addition to all of this card velocity. Secret Identity does a lot of work in this deck as well, especially on like a Planisphere token that you've created, so I'm digging it. Good job, Glenn.
Now, you may have noticed that a lot of the decks in the previous section were what I like to call one-day wonders. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies of the deck, and they didn't have that deep of a run into the tournament, so we don't have a very large sample size as to test how strong they are against the metagame. Well, this next section is going to be looking at pretty much the exact same win rate statistics that we were looking at previously, only now sample size matters. We are only looking at deck archetypes that had at least 4 or more copies into the room, so you're going to get a better picture of how these decks did against the field, and this is where you're going to be looking for some of those sleeper rogue decks that could break out in the format over the next couple of weeks with some tweaking.
The Rude Rakdos deck takes the slot as the winningest deck with at least 3 copies across the events this weekend, and even though we've just talked about the deck in the previous section, I feel like I could gush about this deck for another hour. Instead, though, I want to highlight the fact that the deck wants to play a faster game, and that the cool but rude game plan isn't always the best way to end the game. Sometimes we're using Bloodthorn Flail to discard a Blood Gas before a land drop so we get more things on the battlefield, or discarding a Flamewake Phoenix pre-combat in order to eclipse said flail and give us a ferocious creature to trigger off of. All these discards set up for combat also flip the top card of our deck with an Inti Seneschal of the Sun in play, giving the deck the card velocity that an Artist Talent provides in the Lesson Shells. Apply pressure early, forcing the opponent to exhaust their resources, where we can then land and level up our class and make every creature that 6 afterwards a way the flail can end the game on its own. If we start the game with a curve of like Moonshadow or Marauding Mako into the Inti Flail line of play, we're off to the races with damage that might end the game all on its own before Cool But Rude even hits the battlefield. So while the deck can play the Monument style game, it's foremost an aggressive deck that wants to get opponents low quickly with a long game plan that's harder to disrupt than a traditional aggro deck. And I don't want to undersell or have people underestimate the power of adding Toph Hard-Headed Teacher into an already powerful Stormchaser's Talent Boomerang Basics loop that has made Izzet decks the scourge of Standard and Pioneer for what seems like the past year or so. Creating an Otter token and a 2/2 land thanks to being a lesson stacks up damage fast, while both are incredibly expendable attackers that can chip away while you don't actually have to use the cards you're accumulating in hand until you absolutely need to. Not quite a Snapcaster mage, Toph rebuying something from the graveyard like Removal Lessons or an Accumulate Wisdom is massive when Gran is adding cost reduction so you can cast multiple things in a turn and make an army of land creatures, or pump up existing ones and make a Voltron Earthbended creature. It's a different angle of attack that can end games a lot faster than the Izzet version of the Lessons deck, and an archetype that requires more unique answers that don't work in the usual Lessons head-to-head matches. I want to see where this goes, especially since Toph is currently a one of in these lists, so it relies heavily on the Stormchaser's talent loop when you don't find her, but when you do, this is like a young Pyromancer type deck on steroids. Since we've already gone over the win rate and the statistics from that, let's use this time to talk about where the white aspects of the Bant Rhythm deck are assisting in its win rate increase compared to the Simic cousin deck that's below 50% win rate right now. Brightglass Gearhulk doesn't have the largest package of things to find in this deck, but a combination of finding a Mockingbird to copy the best available thing on the battlefield, like another Cub or your Ouroboros, in addition to finding answers against aggro decks like Seamrip or Meltstrider's Resolve, is extremely powerful. Not to mention, First Strike and Trample makes the Gearhulk itself a force on both offense and defense. Beza, the Bounding Spring, is the other really big add to the main deck that gives you pretty much everything you need against decks that are trying to race you. Life total, extra bodies, and in some cases, mana or much needed card draw. Now, getting access to Soul Guide Lantern in the main deck and Rest in Peace in the sideboard also gives this version of the deck a better game plan against decks like Lessons, where having cards in the graveyard really does matter. Now, I think that Bright Glass Gearhulk as an additional tutor, in air quotes, surpasses Formidable Speaker, at least for the time being, and this is where I'd look if I still wanted to grind Cub decks in the current standard metagame. Flooding the board with cheap creatures and tokens was a staple of the Boros and Jeskai Convoke decks just a few RCQ seasons ago, and Arabella was a consideration in those decks, especially early on. Now, with the Convoke spells themselves being rotated out, Arabella is still trying to find a home in Standard from all the diehard fans of the card. And it might just be the time to try it out. The Last Ronin's Technique is an extremely powerful card if you can cast it for its sneak cost, setting up a large field in Spectral Procession fashion, while providing 3 damage if a War Leader's Call is already in play. Frontline Rush is a sneaky instant that can raise the alarm or provide a decent sized pump for just 2 mana, which plays into another sneaky quick kill if you're able to sneak in Raphael the Night Watcher, which gives your attacking creatures double strike on top of this now big pump spell. I'm not entirely sold on the Delny angle of the deck myself, although it is a sweet synergy with mobilize effects like Stadium Headliner and Voice of Victory. Regardless of how you choose to build around the namesake card though, comboing this small but powerful creature package with cards like Boros Charm and Lightning Helix to finish the job ends games in quick order.
Bant Kona quietly had another high performance weekend with a 56.5% win rate, landing it solidly in 5th place overall for win rate across 3 different pilots using the deck. And although their configurations were a little bit different as far as main deck cards go, I mean, it's Kona, it's Omniscience, and it's Moran River Regent. The supporting cast around it's only really going to change, but the deck functions pretty much the same way. Now, one thing to note of interest is that Hosey Miao's list from the Taiwanese regional championship that got 9th place overall actually didn't have a lot of the normal protection spells for the Kona combo. Instead, it was running Grand Abolisher to shut off your opponent doing anything on your turn whatsoever, so you didn't need to really give Kona hexproof. Now, it's interesting because Grand Abolisher and Voice of Victory kind of do the same exact thing. It's just Grand Abolisher is double white, and it's the fact that you can't activate abilities either, so maybe it gives a little bit of extra protection. Regardless, these lists are still pretty much chugging along doing the same exact thing. 4 copies of stock up in a lot of these lists, 4 copies of Consult the Star Charts, and a bunch of removal, playing a bit of a control combo style of game. The addition of Formidable Speaker in these lists is another great way for the deck to find Kona or find Moran River Regent in a pinch, and just being able to kind of search your deck for a toolbox creature is never a bad thing to have when you're playing something with creature-based combo. So overall, the Bant Kona deck, even though it wasn't putting up high placing results overall on the weekend, still put up a solid win rate across its record and might be something you want to take to an LGS event if you're trying out something new. The Jeskai Midrange list decided to get a little Foot Clan-esque with the addition of cards like Go Ninja Go. And no, I'm not talking about the 90s Vanilla Ice song from TMNT 2, Secret of the Ooze, as much as I wish I was. It's the card that is the namesake of that effect. But this flicker effect, as well as damage-dealing spell, partners extremely well with Shiko Paragon of the Way, Aang Swiss Savior, Gwen Stacy or Ghost Spider, and of course Quantum Riddler and Ashling Rekindled, Ashling Rhymebound. All the creatures within this deck want to be flickered, have value for being flickered, and in the worst case scenario, a 2 mana sorcery speed deal 5 or 4 damage spell to your opponent's stuff is not the worst thing in the world to have on your side of the battlefield. The rest of the deck still plays that Jeskai mid-range control style of gameplay, and as we see the other versions of Jeskai kind of falling by the wayside both in popularity and win rate overall, this seems to be the way that Jeskai is getting a foothold in the metagame. 5 different pilots had a 56.4% win rate overall, and most importantly for a deck that wants to play a control-y style game, this version with a ton of creatures and some blink advantage had 0 ties. So if you are a Jeskai control pilot and you are kind of struggling with where to go with your deck and you don't really want to change your colors overall, just look at adding some of the creature package into the deck and see if going back to Shiko is truly the way. Arabella ain't the only aggro Boros deck that's in this top win rate section here. We also have Boros tokens, which is playing something pretty similar, utilizing that War Leader's Call, some mobilized creatures, and a bunch of early aggressive things on the battlefield, but rounding out the way it wants to win with Ohir Axel to make that War Leader's Call deal 4 damage instead of 1, as well as Song of Totentans to make a bunch of hasty 1/1 rat creatures and just ping your opponent down with that War Leader's Call again. Turning all those rats into 2/2s is never a bad thing, as well as turning all of your mobilized soldiers into 2/2s is never a bad thing. Now we do wind up having the last Ronin's technique in this list as well, which is a way to not only get 3 tokens on the battlefield, Spectral Procession style, but allows you to put something that is going to want to be recast onto the battlefield back into your hand by using its sneak cost. All in all, this deck does play a little bit similar to the way that Arabella plays. However, you're going to be doing things mostly with tokens, and Song of Totentans is going to be your quote-unquote go wide kind of style of thing, rather than trying to double ETB type effects the way that Delny and Arabella were doing in the previous list. So if you really want to play that Convoke go wide style of gameplay, take a look at this list like Mattia Lito's 77th placing list in Turin this past weekend. Might have gone back in time a little bit because Esper Pixie's putting up some pretty good standard results. I want to make sure I'm not doing the wrong video here. No, we're good? All right, awesome. Now, Samuel Estradi wound up taking this list all the way to 2nd place, and Esper Pixie as a whole this weekend had 8 pilots and a 54.9% win rate, so the Pixie deck's doing something pretty good. Now, it did wind up getting some new tools like Dream Beavers, which is a dream to wind up bouncing what Pixies or wanting it using Boomerang basics or anything. Not only does it wind up draining your opponent, but it also helps you fix the top of your library for a deck that really is kind of like feast or famine based on what kind of cards is going to be drawing. Now we wind up having Sig Wanderwine Wisdom, who flips into Sig Wanderbrine Shield. This creature in and of itself can't be blocked and also gives you the ability to draw a card if you wind up dealing some damage. You have a lot of flying evasive threats in the deck, so this is like a cheaper cost Enduring Curiosity that you're going to be able to throw down into the battlefield as well. When it winds up flipping and transforming, you also wind up giving your creatures protection from each color until your next turn. So that's just going to be a way to protect your creatures and make sure you can push through those last couple of points of damage, which is usually kind of hard for a deck that is chipping away with 1 and 2 damage threats altogether. Now, you do of course cap out at Kaito Bane of Nightmares, and the hands you have Kaito versus the hands you don't have Kaito are going to be more or less playing like almost an entirely different deck. But in and of itself, the Pixie deck is still going to be bouncing things like Nowhere to Run. It's still going to be playing things like Momentum Breaker and Grim Bauble, getting advantage over all the small creature decks. And now that you have a little bit extra card advantage and oomph on your top end, as well as draining things with Looping Dream Beavers, you have a way to close the game out that you were severely missing earlier on in the Standards season. I feel like this should just be a staple of every single one of these top 10 win rate sections, at least for like the past season of Standard, because I just keep talking about Mono Green Landfall, and I keep talking about the fact that it's rising in win rate, and now it's winning entire events as well and dominating the metagame. It is the only S-tier deck in popularity, even A or B tier deck in popularity, that has this high of a win rate at 54.4%. Look at the number of matches that were played. Look at the number of pilots that were playing it. And look at John Pugaliski Clark's list that wound up winning the entire Spotlight tournament for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In and of itself, the list is looking very, very similar from week to week. It's just a really good deck to be playing. John's list did wind up playing 2 copies of Royal Treatment as a bit of a protection spell and 2 main deck Melt Strider's Resolves, which gives the deck a little bit of a different angle attack. Melt Strider's Resolve can be used to deal with some smaller creature decks, and the fact that a lot of people are playing more spot removal, more Dimir heavy decks and such, Royal Treatment is going to help protect against some of those things. But the core of Mightform Harmonizer, Ice Till Explorer, Saj Chocobo, and of course the land Bossing Say, making even all of your lands ridiculous threats later in the game, especially with an Earthbender Ascension on the battlefield, is just one of the best things you could be doing in Standard right now, especially if you love turning creatures sideways. Last but not least, a bit of a breakout deck on the weekend. Let's talk about a deck that is turning mana reduction into tempo and advantage. The Momo White deck. Not Mono White, Momo White. Named after, of course, Momo Friendly Flyer. Front and center on your screen here. This is going to be reducing the cost of your next non-lemur creature by 1, and is going to be growing whenever you put a creature with flying onto the battlefield. Now, Momo combines great with a bunch of other cards in the deck. A 1-mana Voice of Victory, Awesome. A 2-mana Sage of the Skies. Not necessarily the greatest because you want to be playing it second, but a 2-mana Halia. Awesome. However, 1-mana Starfield Shepherd off of Warp, also really good. Using that Warp Starfield Shepherd to tap Springleaf Drum and essentially just for free tutor up a 1-drop and play it the same exact turn, even better. Nurturing Pixies in here to wind up bouncing things back to your hand so we can fully take advantage of cards like Cosmic Grand Zenith to make sure that we are casting multiple spells per turn, growing our entire battlefield or making it go wide, whatever we want to be doing. Halia doubles as card advantage because we're most likely going to be playing a bunch of creatures and getting them on the battlefield, especially with the mobilize effect of things like Voice of Victory. Figure of Fable is a way for us to tutor up something we can mana sink into later in the game thanks to Starfield Shepherd. And as I mentioned before, Sage of the Skies gives us multiple threats because we're going to be basically paying 1 for our first one every single turn and then tapping that with a Springleaf Drum to play the next Sage of the Skies for essentially the normal amount of mana altogether, putting 3 things on the battlefield in a single turn. Abandoned Air Temple absolutely shines in this list as well. It's going to basically be a Gavany Township to make absolutely everything on our battlefield grow, and I'm really excited to see the Momo white deck and where it settles in the metagame, because as many creatures and like speed and everything that it has, the mana generation you can get off of things like Springleaf Drum and Momo combined together, it does play a lot of creatures and it doesn't have a ton of protection. So I really want to see where this deck goes if people just start playing like board wipes or just even more powerful removal to deal with low mana cost things such as like Requiting Hacks as opposed to, you know, Nowhere to Run that gives minus.
So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head to head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others.
No, you don't need to blink and rub your eyes or fix your glasses or anything. It's a different Izzet list that's at the top of the tables this time around, with Izzet Prowess being the most played deck and a pretty solid win rate overall as well. 52.3% total against the field and 52.7% in non-mirror matches. Just goes to show that this deck has what it takes to take on the unknown metagame, even in the huge amounts of numbers that we see it being played here this past weekend. Now, it does wind up having some pretty solid matches against all of the top decks in this head-to-head matchup matrix. Your Izzet Lessons, your Mono Green Landfall, your Dimir Midrange, all of those S-tier popularity decks, Izzet Prowess is really solid into, which makes it already a contender for a choice of deck to play alongside its cheaper cost compared to some of the other decks in standard, but in general, something you might want to take to like an RCQ or grind the ladder on Moto with. Now, where the deck doesn't shine, however, is against some of the decks that are going to be able to kind of match it or reset the deck, because it does really rely on its explosive 1 or 2 turns to really dish out the damage and close the game. So, Sunderflocking from Izzet Spellementals, or just the ability to interact at instant speed and tap things down, is going to be something that kind of hurts the deck, as you see a 37.6% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. The Azorius Tempo deck, playing something like High Noon and making the Prowess deck only play 1 spell per turn, heinous. They have to find something like an Into the Floodmaw, otherwise they're just going to be playing really underpowered, overcosted creatures and really bad effects to try to deal with what you're doing, and you can just even interrupt them or ang them and then their turn is over. We also see it struggling against the Momo white deck, which is kind of interesting to me. The speed of the Izzet Prowess deck is definitely up there, and compared to the fact that Momo white can throw a bunch of things onto the battlefield, I just think having flying blockers against a deck that wants to have Slickshot Show Off, or things that are potentially small enough to maybe even block an elusive otter before it winds up attacking and you pump its power up, are just going to be things that the deck has a little bit of trouble dealing with all in all. But against the rest of the field and against the rest of these top decks here, specifically the Simic Rhythm and Dimir Excruciator decks, Izzet Prowess is really showing its speed, its power, and well, its prowess in the standard metagame. Not to be outdone by its brethren, Izzet Prowess deck, Izzet Lessons had a less than stellar weekend, being just under the subpar 50% win rate, having a 49.6% non-mirror match win rate for the weekend across the 4 events, but is still putting up some pretty decent results, being very close to 50% win rate overall, and having some head-to-head matches where it's still extremely favorable, such as Dimir Midrange, Izzet Spellementals, Dimir Excruciator, and the Bant Airbending decks, where it was at least 53, if not higher win rate in all those head-to-heads. It doesn't necessarily struggle the worst against Izzet Prowess either. A 49.1% win rate is very, very close to 50-50, although still a little bit on the losing side. And against Mono Green Landfall, it's a 46% win rate overall, so the deck still has a little bit of legs in the race against that deck to kind of stabilize. Now, where the Izzet Lessons deck is being punished the most is against some of the white permissions-based decks. Azorius Tempo being able to play cards like High Noon and kind of lock you out from casting multiple spells in a turn and being able to trigger your Monument to Endurance and your Artist talent and everything. Not the greatest look for you, Chief. 34.8% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. And the Momo white deck being able to play a bit of some taxing and tempo type effects on you as well. 35.5% win rate as the Momo flying swarm of things, and the fact that Cosmic Grand Zenith and Abandoned Air Temple grow their creatures out of Iroh's Demonstration and even Pyroclasm range pretty quickly means that you may have to kind of switch up your sideboard and maybe look at what the Temur deck is doing with fire magic and stuff, try to get a little bit of extra damage across the board there. And you are going to be losing matchup against the mono red aggro deck as well. Basically anything that's going to be getting things down onto the battlefield early and putting the pressure on where you have to respond rather than set up your game plan, Izzet Lessons is going to kind of struggle against. But again, this is like a pilot skill deck, so if you are able to navigate those situations and you are very sound in your practice with the deck, you are probably going to wind up coming out on top in those matches, even if you have on paper a lower win rate overall. So if you are an Izzet Lessons pilot and Izzet Lessons diehard, don't let the fact that your deck's win rate overall is taking a bit of a hit. You're still one of the most popular decks in the room, you're still being very heavily targeted, and you are still rocking an almost 50% win rate overall. Mono Green Landfall, one of the winningest decks in this head-to-head matrix breakdown at 55% when you factor out all the mirror matches that wound up playing, which is like 200 something different matches because of the fact there are 209 pilots in their room. But the deck in and of itself is not without its own weaknesses. Now, the Cub decks are kept at bay, which means that the Mono Green Landfall deck can play. The Simic Rhythm matchup here is what I'm trying to highlight. A 38.2% win rate means that, yeah, the Landfall deck can get overrun by Crater Hoof Behemoth and a bunch of Monodorics. It doesn't have interaction for Cubs. I've mentioned this before. Some of the decks are running main deck Meltstrider's Resolve and things like that to deal with them. They'll have a slightly better win rate against those decks because of that, but you're still on paper going to be weak to all of their Monodorics and acceleration towards things like Crater Hoof Behemoth and Ouroboros. Things get bigger than yours, a little bit wider than yours, it comes down to a race. And in the fact that you wind up losing to the Bant Airbending deck as well. If you don't wind up having things to deal with their Cubs and their different creatures on the battlefield they're going to airbend and combo with, you're not going to have a good time unless you can just run them over with a Might Form Harmonizer turn or Ice Till Explorer playing multiple lands, triggering landfall extremely early onto your Saw's Chocobos and stuff. So it winds up being a race against those kinds of decks, and it's a race that you don't win all of the time. Against the Izzet Prowess deck, again, another deck that gives the Mono Green Landfall a run for its money in speed, 46.8% win rate overall. But despite the fact that the most popular deck in the room was a slightly losing matchup for the pilots with Mono Green Landfall, it was one of the most winning decks of the event, specifically in this head-to-head matrix in general. So don't read super duper deep into the fact that it has some bad matches, specifically when a lot of those are falling out of the metagame. What you need to do though is, if you're going to an event or if you're playing online, keep track of what is being more popular or not to see if the Mono Green Landfall deck is still the best choice for you to play, or if you need to make some tweaks or you want to take something else to the RCQ or something like that if you feel like Izzet Prowess and Simic Rhythm are going to be out in force against you. Dimir Midrange pilots had another mid-range weekend. 48.2% overall win rate, 48% when you factor out all of the mirror matches, but unfortunately for the Dimir Midrange pilots, a lot of those losses were taken against the top of the metagame decks. Izzet Prowess, Izzet Lessons, and Mono Green Landfall were all in the 40% for the Dimir mid-range win rate, or mid-rate, whatever you want to call it. I can definitely talk for a living. But regardless of all of that, a lot of the other wins for the Dimir deck were picked up from some of the less popular decks, like the Izzet Spellementals deck. Dimir is not necessarily overcommitting to the board, and in some cases, bouncing things back to the hand is a great thing here, so Sunderflock doesn't affect them as much. Dimir Excruciator, you've already kind of seen this. When you're playing Dimir midrange, a little bit more tempo based, you have a slight edge against the decks that's a little bit more control based, so it's a 60% win rate in that matchup. And in the head-to-head against the mid-range tempo-y style decks, Dimir mid-range is coming out ahead of Azorius tempo since it's not necessarily as affected by its stall metrics like High Noon, and if they wind up playing things like Even Interrupter or, Aang Swift Savior, you can deal with the threats that they're playing on your turn and just be able to kind of shut off what they're doing and get rid of their clock with enough time for you to stick like a Kaito or something that's hard for them to interact with. Now, the decks that it is going to be struggling against are, again, some of the more aggressive play a bunch of things on the board decks. Simic Rhythm and Momo White are both matches that look kind of bad for it on paper. These decks go wide, these decks go fast, these decks put a lot of things onto the battlefield, and Day of Black Sun can only do so much from your sideboard to kind of clean up that mess. So as long as the Dimir mid-range deck is going 1-for-1 and needs to kind of try to trade off with blockers, these go wide, go tall, go fast decks are going to be beating up on you. All right, Izzet Spellementals? You had a pretty solid weekend here. 52% win rate, 52.1% when you factor out mirror matches, and having a winning head-to-head matchup against the most popular deck in the room. Sounds like you're all whistles and rainbows and stuff, right? Time to go party. Well, not quite, because the deck still has some issues against some of the other decks in the metagame. Unfortunately for it is everything below Izzet Prowess, or directly below it. Izzet Lessons, Mono Green Landfall, and surprisingly Dimir Midrange, all going to be difficult matches for the Izzet Spellementals deck to go head-to-head against. Likewise, the Dimir Excruciator list is also going to be a little bit more difficult, because when you're playing a tempo spell-based deck and something that wants to tap down creatures and bounce things back to their hands, lo and behold, when they're not playing a ton of creatures, it's not the greatest head-to-head matchup for you overall, specifically when one of them just gets rid of most of your library. Now against the decks that are more creature based, Simic Rhythm, Azorius Tempo, Bant, Airbending, and the Momo White deck, you have a really solid head-to-head matchup. That of course explains the fact that your overall win rate versus the field is a little bit higher this weekend as well. When decks are playing a bunch of creatures, you're playing Boros Dragons, you're playing all these really cool elementals and things like that, or not necessarily elementals because those don't get bounced by Sunderflock, but you're playing a bunch of these mid-rangey, grindy creatures, your Ouroboros, all these different monument decks throwing these aggro creatures onto the battlefield and trying to generate some discard advantage. Bouncing everything back to your opponent's hand and resetting their board and keeping yours Thing in the Ice style with a Sunderflock, it's a pretty good strategy to have. So if you think you're going to be playing against a lot of creature decks, Izzet Spellementals is going to be something that you can kind of do. You can keep them off tempo for the first couple turns, things get out of hand, you Sunderflock them. Or you play a bunch of spells in your first 2 to 3 turns and you Sunderflock extremely early and play a bunch of cheap, powerful creatures because of it. It's a really solid game plan. It does take a little bit of practice to kind of learn and execute the specific lines and know when to go for a fast start versus kind of wait for your opponent to overcommit to the board. But Spellementals, I'm liking the way it looks right now. Dimir Excruciator is excruciatingly losing win rate overall. A 43.8% non-mirror match win rate is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the top matrix here this weekend. And it's just the fact that Dimir Excruciator is now a known quantity, and people are trying to change up the list. We have people putting more creatures into the list, which then makes it less control-y, which makes it more susceptible to removal, so you wind up seeing it lose out against decks like Dimir Midrange, and then kind of struggle against, the fact that they don't have as many interactive spells to deal with things like the Bant Airbending combo or the Izzet Prowess deck, which is usually something that does a little worse into control style decks. You are still not necessarily the best against Mono Green Landfall, which just goes really, really fast and doesn't really care as long as they have a certain number of lands left in their library to Landfall trigger off of. And you are a little bit more difficult against the Izzet Lessons deck because if you're cutting your interaction, your control-y package, and putting some more things into your deck to play to the board, you don't have as many ways in the Dimir colors to deal with the main engine from the Izzet Lessons deck. So while Dimir Excruciator isn't not necessarily a dead deck overall, it it is on its way out the door unless you kind of change things up a little bit. I keep alluding to playing a little bit more of a control-y style. I know they're not like taking out tons of spells and putting tons of creatures in there, but I think trimming it down to just the combo essentials and playing a control style game is still the more ideal way to execute the Excruciator deck. We'll have to see if pilots kind of go back to that one, if its win rate goes up, or if people just drop the deck entirely and go back to the mid-range decks. So Simic Rhythm didn't do as well win rate wise as its cousin Bant Rhythm did, but it did have a lot more pilots playing it. A 47.9% non-mirror matchup is not the greatest win rate in the world, but it's still on the higher side for 40%. I'm coping a little bit as my Badger Mole Cubs and my Ouroboros sit there in my sleeves currently, and I kind of wait for a better time to play them. It's not the worst time in the world though, so long as you're not running into Izzet Prowess and Izzet Spellementals a lot at your store or online. However, those two decks are a little bit of the worst side of matchups, specifically Spellementals with a 26.9% win rate. Don't really want to be playing Badger Mole Cub and Crater Hoof Behemoth anywhere near Sunderflock. However, if you're playing against Izzet Lessons, Mono Green Landfall, and Dimir Midrange, which are 3 of the 4 S tier popularity decks, the Cub deck is not the worst thing to bring to a metagame full of that. Likewise, the Azorius Tempo deck, they don't necessarily have the means to tempo you out that soon, and if you have a way to deal with their first high noon, it's usually unlikely they have another one in your hand, unless you're me playing at Standard Showdown, in which case your opponent plays multiple of them. Regardless of a bad beats anecdote, you have a 52.9% win rate in that head-to-head matchup since you're just a little too fast and a little too furious. Likewise, the other more aggressive decks in the format, Momo White and Mono Red Aggro, you can eke out on the positive side of that head-to-head matchup just by being faster and bigger than their fast and aggressive game plans. So Simic Cub, Simic Rhythm, whatever you want to call it, the deck is still alive and kicking. It's just a little bit more metagame dependent than what it used to be.
Let's talk Azorius Tempo, because as this deck pops up at more and more events in the hands of more and more pilots, it's going to be a known quantity with very distinct strengths and very distinct weaknesses. Now, looking at the top of these head-to-head matches, you can see that Azorius Tempo is attacking the top end of the metagame, the more popular decks in the room, extremely well, targeting down these Izzet decks that really want to sling spells, and cards like High Noon in the main deck really stop them from doing that, or just being able to airbend or plot their spells against them means that they're not getting the full value out of their creatures or their spell package. 65.2% win rate into Izzet Lessons is one of the big reasons why this Azorius Tempo deck wound up popping up in the first place, but it takes a little while to go down before you find any other redeeming matches in this head-to-head matrix, which is why the deck suffered a 48.7% win rate against the field, whether you count mirror matches or not. It's struggling against Mono Green Landfall, which is rising in popularity and absolutely trouncing the deck with Trample, as well as the fact that Bossing Say doesn't matter about your High Noon in play, and it isn't able to be airbent, and it isn't able to be plotted. Well, it can be airbent, I guess, if you make it a creature itself, but it's going to just be putting value upon value into play. It's very difficult for this deck to interact with. The Dimir midrange deck is also a very difficult matchup for the Azorius Tempo deck here. 31.3% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. I guess being able to sneak in Kaito and having a slightly faster clock from the Dimir side is going to be something that, in combination with some disruption and spot removal, makes it difficult for the Azorius Tempo deck to kind of close against. And even if the Dimir midrange deck gets hit with the High Noon, playing one spell per turn and playing on your opponent's turn if you can keep a Voice of Victory off the field isn't the worst thing in the world. Izzet Spellementals only being a 43.8% win rate for Azorius Tempo is a little interesting, but once the graveyard is stocked with spells, it's kind of difficult to stop the flurry of threats that are flying down from that elemental style spell slinging deck. Now, looking at the rest of the matchup matrices, it's not the greatest news in the world, especially as the aggressive decks kind of come into the fray, and a tempo deck like this is going to struggle if people are stacking up damage from decks like Momo White. So if you are an Azorius Tempo player, you might want to tweak a couple cards in your main deck or sideboard to try to combat the rest of the metagame a little bit better. You may lose a couple percentage points against your already good Izzet matches, but you need to do something if you want to survive the way that the metagame is changing in Standard.
I alluded to this a little bit earlier in the video as well, but Bant Airbending is evolving over the course of these couple of tournaments as people kind of figure out that Badger Mole Cub decks are only kind of good into specific metagames, so sometimes you need to cut the Cubs and deal with what's left over. However, this past last weekend, Bant Airbending pilots are a little bit split on those decisions. We saw some Cub decks, we saw some non-Cub decks, we saw ones with a couple of Cubs and not the full 4/4s. We saw decks playing lesser mana dorks in general, overall playing more control-y style things. Regardless, Airbending is evolving, and it is still hovering at a 48.9% win rate, whether you count total matches or non-mirror matches overall. Point in case, however, it is struggling against a lot of the Izzet decks, specifically due to their permission spells and their speed in the cases of things like Izzet Prowess. So if you're playing against a deck that is interaction heavy, then you obviously want to be playing to the board a little bit earlier, but you have things like Firebending Lesson, you have things like Combustion Technique, and you have ways that you can deal with your different ways that you're ramping in your mana, your Cubs, your Elves, etc. Now, if you wind up playing a little bit more of a control-y style, you're a little bit slower, and that opens you up to some of the more aggressive style of decks. At this event specifically, however, Bant Airbending had a really solid head-to-head matchup against Mono Green Landfall and the Momo White and Mono Red aggro list, as you can see on your screen here. Interestingly enough, it was also very good into the Azorius Tempo deck, which is usually something that's playing high noons and permission spells and all these different things that kind of interact with the Airbending combo, but Airbending pilots are playing very smartly around these kinds of things and eking out a 64.3% win rate overall in the head-to-head. Now, people are still playing some of the older metagame decks at your LGS, like your Dimir Excruciators and your Simic Rhythms. Bant Airbending is still the way to go. So which way you're going to build the deck and what metagame you're going to choose to attack is entirely up to you. But if you do choose to do so, just know that there will be some matches that are bad, some matches that are good, and you just got to figure out which ones you're ready for. Momo White, on its breakout weekend, being played as a deck or an archetype in general, had the second highest win rate on this head-to-head matchup matrix, so it's a pretty good place to debut in the standard metagame. 54.2% win rate overall when you factor out some of the mirror matches that wound up playing. Really solid place to be. And when you look at the decks that it was attacking in the metagame here, it wound up doing very well against Izzet Prowess and Izzet Lesson, so the Izzet decks of the format, where it's rocking a 69, pretty nice win rate, against the Prowess deck and a 64.5% win rate against the Lesson shell. It also wound up doing extremely well into Dimir Midrange and the Azorius Tempo deck, so the more mid-rangey kind of tempo interactive decks. It was also putting up some really solid results against. These decks tend to go 1-for-1 or want to kind of slow you down earlier on in the game. If you wind up playing Momo Springleaf Drum, it's really difficult to slow you down on like your turn 2 or 3, their turn 1 or 2. So really, really good stuff coming out from the Momo White deck there. Now, where it is struggling, unfortunately, is against the Mono Green Landfall deck. And talked about this. This is the only deck in this head-to-head matchup matrix that had a better overall win rate than Momo White, and it's going to be a deck that should keep rising in popularity because aggro decks are in a pretty decent spot, and this is like the best version of an aggro deck that the format has right now. 38.9% win rate in that head-to-head matchup for the Momo White deck. Now, Momo White also kind of lacks interaction. It has a little bit of permission, like taxi type effects, specifically in some of the sideboard packages. Sometimes we're getting things like Rest in Peace, you have Sheltered by Ghosts to kind of remove key threats and everything, but you don't really have access to High Noon because you're playing multiple things per turn. Sure, you have Clarion Conqueror, and that shuts off some of the decks like the Cub decks and things like that, which is why you have a slightly higher win rate into those head-to-head matches, but you don't really have things to deal with stuff on the stack. You don't really have things to deal with board wipes, and that's where this aggressive white deck is going to struggle, specifically in the more control-y Dimir Excruciator head-to-head matchup, where it had a 33.3% win rate. You also basically just have Get Lost as your interaction against opposing creatures. You're kind of flying over and getting bigger than them, which means a 28.6% win rate against the Bant Airbending deck is not the greatest look for the deck. You do have some Seam Rips in a couple of the main decks as well, but that's only really going to hit like their Cubs and their Mana Acceleration and none of their combo interactive pieces. So Momo White aggressive, go wide, things get big, things fly. I like this deck. I bought the cards for it that I was missing, and I'm going to be playing some of it in paper to try it out. I think it's in a pretty unique spot. I don't think it's going to keep this high of a win rate, but I like this direction that aggro is going instead of just being landfall or bust. Now, for everything I said about liking the direction that aggro is going for Momo White, I'm not entirely sure about the mono red aggro deck. This one just seems a little bit too targeted on the current stage of the metagame, with a 48.5% win rate against the field, whether it's overall or non-mirror matches altogether. Now, this is basically attacking the Izzet lists, the Izzet Prowess and the Izzet Lessons list, which is where it's having a 55.8 and 61.2 win rate respectively. It also ends up having some splash against the Izzet Spellementals deck. I think this is just the fact that the mono red deck can be kind of fast and has some very punishing openers. A lot of the cantrips from the Spellementals deck actually draw cards, so you know some of the effects that mono red was having for tax effects or just ping effects become way more effective against Spellementals than against some of the other tempo-based list running, or not tempo-based, but card advantage, tempo-style decks that are playing stock up and consult the star charts and things like that. But then again, or against the rest of the metagame, this is where mono red is struggling to get bigger than mono green Landfall. It's just getting absolutely run over in a 20.7% head-to-head matchup for there. It's struggling against one-for-one removal, like the things that Dimir Midrange and Dimir Excruciator packing in of itself, and it's kind of struggling against decks that go bigger and wider than it, like Simic Rhythm and the Momo White deck from this past weekend. So if you really want to play red and aggro, I would look at playing Izzet Prowess, because that's one of the best performing decks in the room this past weekend, or the multiple rooms that are there. And if you really want to play red decks that turn things sideways and play more things to the board, look at some of those Boros aggro, the Arabella or the tokens list that we had in our top 10 win rate list, and maybe try pivoting towards that, because I just don't think that mono red specifically is the best metagame call right now. We might be winding down on standard RCQ season and standard RC season altogether, but things are still getting shaken up all across the metagame. The Ninja Turtle set has made a lot of changes to decks that a lot of people might not necessarily have been expecting, and we've seen some pretty cool ideas pop up, although be them a little cool and rude at the same time. If there's something in standard that you've enjoyed spell slinging, let me know in the comments down below. What's got your kind of, I don't know, I was thinking of a pun, but I'm just gonna leave this part and not cut it out. Just let me know what you're playing in standard in the comments down below. While you're there, you can hit that thumbs up button so the YouTube algorithm gods, as well as myself, know that y'all are still loving these metagame recaps. While you are down there, of course, you can wind up clicking on the link in my description below to help support me by using my referral or affiliate link for ManaPool. If any of these decks have sparked your curiosity and you want to start slinging standard spells at your LGS, I would greatly appreciate if you use that referral link, so that when you order cards on ManaPool, not only do you wind up getting extra mana and putting that towards future purchases, but you also help support me and my channel by just clicking a link down below. Likewise, if you're going to be using the online version of playing cards, such as Magic the Gathering Online, you can use my Mana Traders link or my referral code down below. OTTV is going to be the code to type in when you get that. I'm going to get a way to support the channel if you are playing digital Magic and not paper Magic. Of course, you're going to get access to rental services and all that jazz that's over on the Mana Traders website. I won't go into a huge spiel about that, but I'd greatly appreciate if you're going to use it. Help support the channel if you've enjoyed this video. You can also click the join button while you're down there. I know there's just so much stuff I'm throwing at you, but if you're so inclined to, clicking join will let you become one of my members who monetarily support this and all videos on my channel, and in exchange for that, I give them a trade offer of great member benefits. Discord access for the tier 2 members, just being able to get early access to my video content, member-specific content like some deck guides when I'm talking about what's going to be played in the metagame and stuff, or what my expectations are for upcoming events, and just, you know, being able to speak directly with me and just kind of get some ideas for deck lists and stuff that they're throwing around if you have Discord access. So that's something that tickles your fancy. You can click that join button down below or on my channel's homepage to show your devotion. And just as a final note, I would love it if you could just tap that subscribe button. It helps me and helps you stay up to date on all sorts of Magic the Gathering analysis, deck techs, and just general Magic videos from me. See you at the next one.